It's amazing how many disasters start with someone being told, "Don't do that," and deciding the rules shouldn't apply to them. From a Karen who blocked access at a community pool until the situation turned deadly, to a Karen who climbed over her neighbor's fence after the authorities refused to take her side and ended up facing something far worse on the other side.
It was June 28, 2018, in Tucson, Arizona. By midday, the temperature had reached 104 degrees, and desert wildlife was active. Longtime residents knew that rattlesnakes moved through the subdivision walls and drainage corridors during the summer, and that the safest response was distance. Roxanne Gillis, 46, had lived in the neighborhood for 3 years and served on the Homeowners Association board. She was known for escalating minor issues to city departments and demanding immediate corrective action. Over the previous year, she had contacted animal control twice about snakes near the common area, insisting they be removed. Each time she was informed that snakes on private or undeveloped land were not under city jurisdiction, and that residents were advised to leave them alone. She viewed those explanations as inadequate and dismissive. In the weeks leading up to the incident, she had also raised concerns during HOA discussions about reducing spending on outside contractors, including wildlife relocation services. That afternoon, during her usual midday walk, a neighbor spotted a diamondback rattlesnake coiled at the base of a block wall along a shared pathway. The neighbor stepped back and began calling a licensed wildlife relocator. Roxanne arrived moments later and pushed past the small cluster of neighbors to get a clearer look. Despite being told repeatedly to stay back, she stepped closer to the wall and leaned forward, studying the snake with the same measured focus she used during Homeowners Association inspections. She waved off the suggestion to wait for a professional and positioned herself between the snake and the others, effectively taking control of the scene. She indicated that she had handled situations like this before and that it did not require outside help. She had no gloves, no tools, and no protective equipment. When someone pointed that out, she crouched anyway, lowering herself to within a few feet of the coiled rattlesnake. The snake remained tight and elevated, its head angled toward her movement. The snake began to rattle as she extended her hand toward its tail. Several neighbors backed away and told her to stop. She hesitated only briefly, then leaned in again and reached closer. The rattlesnake struck forward in a rapid arc and bit her right hand between the thumb and index finger. Roxanne stood abruptly and stepped backward. 2 puncture wounds were immediately visible. The neighbor called 911 without delay. Paramedics arrived approximately 20 minutes later. During transport, her hand began swelling rapidly, and she reported increasing pain and dizziness. At the hospital, physicians administered anti-venom and admitted her to intensive care for monitoring. Laboratory tests revealed significant disruption to her blood's clotting function, a known complication of rattlesnake envenomation. Despite additional antivenom and aggressive supportive treatment, she developed internal bleeding overnight. Her condition deteriorated steadily. Blood pressure levels fell to critical readings, and efforts to stabilize her were unsuccessful. Roxanne Gillis was pronounced dead the following morning. An autopsy determined the cause of death to be complications of rattlesnake envenomation. In the weeks that followed, the Homeowners Association circulated guidance reminding residents not to approach or attempt to relocate wildlife and to contact licensed professionals instead. The neighbor, who had initially called for help, provided a statement confirming that Roxanne had ignored repeated warnings to keep her distance. The snake was later located by a contracted wildlife relocator and removed from the area without further incident. It was July 18th, 2015, in Henderson, Nevada. The desert evening had settled over the HOA community on Pinecrest Drive the way it always did in summer, the heat dropping slowly after sundown and the air going still and quiet. In a neighborhood like this one, where the houses sat close together and the streets were empty by 9, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows each other. Deborah Klein, 53, had lived in the community for 7 years and had served as HOA treasurer for the last 4 of them. People who knew her described her as detail-oriented and committed to the rules that kept the community running the way it was supposed to. She attended every board meeting, filed every form correctly, and expected her neighbors to follow the same standards she held herself to. She was not the kind of person who let something slide. And I want to be fair to Deborah here, because on paper, none of that sounds unreasonable. The problem was what happened when the system told her no. The wind chimes had been hanging on her neighbor's back porch for years. They were not particularly loud. On most nights, you would not notice them unless you were standing right next to the fence. The other neighbors on the street had lived alongside them for years without a single complaint, but Deborah had decided she did not like them, and that was enough. She walked next door one evening and knocked. When her neighbor answered, Deborah told her the chimes needed to come down. Her neighbor said they had been there for years and asked politely what the problem was. Deborah's voice went up. She told her neighbor that the sound was disruptive and inconsiderate, and that a person who actually cared about the people around her would have taken them down already. Her neighbor tried to respond, but Deborah kept talking, her voice getting louder, her finger pointing toward the backyard. Her neighbor said she was not going to stand on her own porch and be spoken to that way, and closed the door. That's exactly what I would do if I was the neighbor. I won't watch you stand on my porch yell at me. Deborah stood there for a moment. Then she walked home and filed a formal HOA complaint the next morning, then a second, then a third. She wrote each one carefully, documented the dates and times she claimed to have been disturbed, and submitted them through the proper channels. Each one was reviewed. Each time the determination came back the same. The wind chimes did not meet the threshold for a noise violation under the community's governing documents. They were not loud enough. They were not frequent enough. The board could not take action. And this is where it starts to get uncomfortable, because most people accept that answer and move on. Deborah did not. The final rejection letter arrived on July 15th. Deborah read it twice and put it in her HOA folder. 3 days passed. The chimes were still there. Her neighbor had not spoken to her since the night she closed the door. The board had done nothing. Nobody was going to do anything. Deborah decided she would handle it herself. On the evening of July 18th, shortly after 11, Deborah walked to the back of her property carrying a small step stool. The fence between her yard and her neighbor's was a standard 6-foot wooden privacy fence. She placed the stool against the base, climbed up, swung her leg over the top, and dropped down onto the other side. She landed awkwardly, her right wrist taking the full impact as she tried to catch herself. The pain was immediate. She left the yard without touching the chimes and drove herself to the emergency room at a hospital, where she was treated for a hairline fracture of the wrist and discharged with a brace and instructions to rest it for at least a week. And what gets me is that at this point, she had a broken wrist. It should have been the moment she let it go. But guess what happened next? She was back at the fence the following night. The doctor had told her to rest the wrist and keep the brace on for at least a week. By the following evening, she had already decided it was not that bad. The chimes were still there. A sore wrist was not going to change any of that. She went slower this time, more careful at the top, more deliberate about how she was going to come down on the other side. What gets me is that she had thought it through, and this is what she came up with. The chimes were right there, maybe 8 feet away, hanging from a hook on the porch overhang. She got to the top of the fence and swung her leg over. Her foot reached for the ground on the other side. She misjudged the distance in the dark. Her foot came down short, and she lost her balance, pitching forward with nothing to grab onto. She fell forward and down, and her head struck the decorative stone edging that ran along the base of her neighbor's garden bed. The stones were fixed in place and had no give. The impact was direct. She did not get up. She was found the following morning after she failed to respond to calls, and a neighbor requested a welfare check. Officers and paramedics entered the yard and found Deborah on the ground near the fence line. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as traumatic brain injury sustained from the fall. She was 53 years old. Investigators determined the incident resulted from unauthorized entry onto private property during a second attempt to remove an object that had been the subject of a failed complaint process. And guess what? The wind chimes were still hanging on the neighbor's porch when officers arrived that morning. They were intact. They were undisturbed.
It was July 18, 2015. The morning air at Yellowstone National Park carried the sharp, sulfuric smell of thermal activity, while tourists gathered along the boardwalks surrounding the geyser bay. Kylie Matthews, a 37-year-old stay-at-home mother from Cheyenne, Wyoming, lingered near the protective barrier with her phone ring, visibly frustrated that the angle wasn't working. Kylie was a normal mother who enjoyed capturing family memories in nature, often taking photos during outing. Friends and family described her as eager to get good shots, sometimes prioritizing pictures over her own safety. She posted pictures daily, often dismissing safety warnings as overreactions by other people who didn't understand. That morning, she had already complained to multiple rangers about restrictive barriers blocking. Yellowstone's thermal features form when superheated water rises through volcanic rock, dissolving mineral fragile crusts around. These crusts appear stable, but often are less, supported only by pressure. Park regulations require visitors on designated as the ground test inches beneath the surface can. Warning signs posted every explicitly state that step marked can result in. That morning, Kylie had received 3 separate warnings from park rangers about approaching thermal features too closely. She openly dismissed them to nearby tourists, stating that rangers exaggerated dangers to justify their jobs. Her 2 children, ages 8 and 10, remained safely positioned on the boardwalk approximately 40 feet behind her. Multiple witnesses later reported she seemed determined to capture a specific knowing both the thermal pool and mountain backdrop. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, Kylie climbed over the wooden barrier rail, which was approximately waist-high. Despite shouted warnings from at least 6 witnesses, she walked roughly 15 feet onto the mineral crust, testing each step briefly before continuing. Her phone remained extended as she adjusted her position, apparently reviewing the framing. The crust showed no immediate signs of weakness. Moments later, the ground collapsed beneath her left foot. The mineral shelf gave way instantly, plunging Kylie into the thermal pool with no time to grab surrounding terrain. She dropped approximately 6 feet into water measuring 205 degrees Fahrenheit with a pH of 3.5, strongly acidic and capable of causing chemical burns. Her screams lasted roughly a few seconds before abruptly stopping, as reported by witnesses. The boiling acidic water caused immediate catastrophic tissue. Her synthetic athletic clothing was compromised by heat and adhered to areas of severe burns. Third-degree burns covered her face, torso, and limbs almost instantly, causing the outer skin layers to char black while deeper tissue necrosis developed rapidly. The extreme heat triggered immediate shock, leading to rapid cardiovascular collapse. Witnesses described seeing her body convulse once before becoming submerged or down. Park rangers arrived immediately, following the screams, but could not attempt rescue due to the lethal water temperature and unstable ground conditions. Her children remained on the boardwalk, physically restrained by other tourists. Recovery operations began 3 hours later after hazard assessment and careful approach to the unstable terrain. Her remains were chemically degraded, leaving them fragmented and severely disfigured. The medical examiner determined death resulted from thermal and chemical burns affecting over 70% of body surface area. Park authorities reinforced barrier systems throughout the thermal basin following the incident. Kylie's ex-husband deleted all social media accounts within 1 week and declined media interviews.
It was June 12, 2016, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Tampa, Florida. The afternoon heat pressed down on the residential streets as families retreated indoors to escape the humidity. Inside a modest 2-story home, 49-year-old Vintel Lewis was preparing what she believed would be an educational demonstration for her online followers. Vintel worked in home decor resale and had built a reputation for being outspoken about consumer issues. She frequently posted videos challenging what she saw as corporate deception, often filming confrontations with service technicians. The attention, both supportive and critical, fueled her growing online presence and reinforced her confidence in her own conclusions. Days earlier, Vintel confronted the appliance repair technician inside her kitchen while recording on her phone. She accused him of inflating service costs by exaggerating safety risks and insisted she would expose what she described as dishonest industry practices. When he explained that operating a microwave with its outer casing removed could result in lethal electrocution, particularly from the high-voltage capacitor that can retain charge even after being unplugged. She repeatedly interrupted him and demanded technical proof beyond manufacturer warnings. The technician declined to proceed after she refused to sign the required liability waiver for internal servicing. Later that evening, she uploaded edited footage of the exchange, framing the warning as a scare tactic designed to pressure customers into unnecessary repairs. In the comment section, she encouraged viewers to question appliance safety guidelines and stated she would demonstrate that the risk was overstated. That afternoon, she set up recording equipment in her kitchen and prepared to recreate the scenario. Using a screwdriver, she removed the microwave's outer shell, exposing internal wiring, the transformer, and the high-voltage capacitor. Safety labels were clearly visible along the metal chassis. She then deliberately bypassed the door interlock switch, the mechanism designed to prevent operation when the door is open, believing it existed to restrict performance rather than protect users. Her adult daughter stood several feet away, filming from a second angle as Vintel leaned toward the exposed circuitry. The kitchen light reflected sharply off the bare metal components, now energized and unshielded. With the camera rolling, Vintel placed a metal bowl inside the open microwave cavity and activated the unit. Almost immediately, electrical arcing formed inside the exposed chassis. A sharp snapping sound followed as insulation began to fail and light smoke rose from the wiring. Instead of stepping back, Vintel reached toward the exposed transformer while it remained energized. Her hand made contact with wiring carrying over 2,000 volts. The current locked her muscles, causing her to collapse onto the tile floor. She gasped and convulsed as the shock disrupted her heart's rhythm. Video later reviewed by investigators showed brief, involuntary movement before she became unresponsive. Her daughter rushed to shut off the power as smoke thickened near the ceiling. Insulation near the transformer began to smolder, producing additional smoke but remaining confined to the internal wiring area. By the time the power was cut, Vintel lay motionless beside the appliance. Emergency services were called immediately. Fire crews arrived within 8 minutes, containing the localized kitchen fire before it spread beyond the immediate area. Resuscitation efforts began on scene. According to the incident report, she entered ventricular fibrillation and did not regain a stable rhythm despite advanced life support. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the hospital. Investigators later confirmed the safety interlock had been deliberately bypassed and the high-voltage system energized during contact. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from cardiac arrhythmia triggered by electrocution. The incident was ruled accidental, noting that factory safety mechanism had been intentionally disabled. It was July 4th, 2016, in Riverbend, Wisconsin, USA. During the town's annual Independence Day parade, streets were lined with cheering crowds behind rope barriers as balloons drifted unpredictably in gusts up to 15 miles per hour. Gloria Winslow, 51, was known in Riverbend for attending city council and school board meetings not for children in the system, but for enjoying a public voice. She had run unsuccessfully for local office twice and managed a small insurance office where staff saw her as meticulous, argumentative, and prone to escalate minor complaints. Gloria held strict opinions on public behavior, often treating shared spaces as stages for moral enforcement. She had once been asked to leave a family entertainment venue for confronting a birthday party and habitually stood with arms crossed and chin raised, a posture co-workers nicknamed the Gloria. Floats moved along Main Street at roughly 3 to 5 miles per hour, some extending several feet beyond their towing vehicle. Spectators were expected to remain behind rope barriers as volunteers kept the route clear. Wind pushed balloon and lightweight decorations unpredictably toward the crowd. 4-year-old Nolan Prescott stood with his mother, holding a large red star-shaped helium balloon purchased from a vendor. Nolan bounced excitedly as the balloon floated above the rope barrier. Gloria, standing nearby, had already complained about the crowd standing too close and about teenagers blocking her view. When the balloon drifted near her face again, she snapped at Nolan's mother to control the child, then suddenly snatched the balloon string from Nolan's hand, causing him to cry. Still lecturing the mother about public behavior, Gloria stepped backward while holding the balloon, moving toward the rope barrier that had briefly gone slack when a volunteer shifted position. At that moment, float number 7, a large flatbed truck carrying a community display, passed directly beside them. The decorative platform extended about 3 feet beyond the vehicle on the crowd side. Still focused on the argument and holding Nolan's balloon, Gloria stepped backward past the rope barrier and into the active parade lane without looking. The float struck her at hip height on her left side. Though moving slowly, the combined mass of truck and float totaled roughly 8,400 pounds. The impact knocked her to the ground, partially under the platform. The rear wheels missed her body, but part of the float's metal frame struck across her upper chest and neck as the driver moved forward several feet before stopping. The impact fractured her sternum, broke 4 ribs on the left side, 2 puncturing her left lung, and caused severe trauma to her larynx. Gloria remained conscious, but struggled to breathe as a nurse in the crowd rushed forward and assessed her condition, noting labored breathing and wet, gurgling sounds consistent with a collapsed lung and internal bleeding. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and airlifted Gloria to a regional hospital in Riverbend. She died in surgery from internal hemorrhage and respiratory failure. Multiple videos from cell phones and parade cameras documented her stepping past the barrier and taking the balloon. The county medical examiner determined the cause of death was blunt chest trauma, leading to internal bleeding and respiratory failure. Even at low speeds, the vehicle's mass made contact fatal, and investigators noted that Gloria had stepped past the safety barrier and into the active parade lane moments before impact. Nolan was unharmed, though he asked about his balloon for days afterward. His mother was cleared of any wrongdoing. Parade organizers added additional barrier lines and increased volunteer coverage for future events. Gloria's estate was handled by her 2 adult children, and co-workers held a small memorial, acknowledging privately that her tendency to argue in public made the outcome tragically unsurprising. It was June 2015 in Tucson, Arizona. The afternoon heat outside had pushed past 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of dry desert heat that makes every air-conditioned room feel like a relief the moment you walk through the door. The restaurant was at full lunch capacity, tables close together, the room loud with midday service. Sandra had come in for a late lunch, bringing Cooper with her as she routinely did despite repeated pushback from staff in similar places. I've thought about what that room must have felt like to walk into, and I think that matters more than it seems. Sandra Fielding was 46, an office manager, confident, vocal, and by all accounts, someone who did not back down from confrontation easily. She had owned a mixed-breed golden retriever named Cooper for 6 years. Cooper wore a service vet she had purchased online. He had no task training, no certification, no behavioral conditioning specific to any medical or accessibility. For 3 years, Sandra had been bringing him into restaurants, grocery stores, and retail locations, and when staff questioned her, she did not quietly comply. She filmed it. She posted the video, she made it a pattern, and she made it public. I want to be clear that I'm not touching the broader conversation about service animal access here. Genuine service animals are a different subject entirely. What I'm talking about is one specific situation with one specific outcome. What makes this case different from a story about someone bending the rules is what was sitting in Sandra's medical file the entire time. Her allergy to dog dander and saliva had been documented since 2009. A follow-up in 2013 noted that the sensitivity had worsened. Her physician had recommended she carry an epinephrine auto-injector. The prescription was written. It was never filled. Sandra's position, as far as anyone who knew her could tell, was that Cooper specifically didn't affect her, and for 6 years of daily low-level exposure, that had been more or less true. I think that's the part of this story I find most difficult to reason through, because 6 years of being fine is a very convincing argument to make to yourself. until it isn't. Here's something I looked into specifically because I wanted to understand how this could escalate so fast after years of nothing. The dose of allergen matters. Daily ambient exposure to a dog you live with is a fundamentally different load on the immune system than direct contact with saliva on your face and neck. That distinction isn't subtle from a biological standpoint. It's the difference between background noise and a trigger. And that's exactly what happened when Cooper jumped up during the confrontation. Sandra and Cooper were seated without immediate issue. A server approached quietly and asked to see documentation. Sandra stood up and the confrontation began. Raised voice, escalating toward a manager. During it, Cooper jumped up against her, making direct contact with her face and neck. Within minutes, she was describing itching around her eyes and a tightening in her throat. She kept going. I don't think anyone in that room understood what they were watching until it was already too late. Hives appeared across her neck and chest. Her breathing became audibly labored. People called for emergency services. Sandra lost consciousness before they arrived. Without epinephrine in those first critical minutes, the reaction had nothing to stop it, and her prescription had never been filled, so there was nothing on her, nothing in her bag, nothing that could have immediately countered the reaction. Sandra was pronounced dead at the hospital. Confirmed cause was anaphylactic shock triggered by dog allergen exposure. Her medical records confirmed the documented allergy and its progression. Prescription records confirmed the auto-injector was never filled. Witness statements from staff and several diners were collected, and security footage timestamps were consistent. Cooper was surrendered to animal control that same day. He was not euthanized. No liability was assigned to the restaurant. Case closed. I've gone back through this one more than most, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. The allergy was documented. The prescription existed. The recommendation was clear. Every piece of information she needed to protect herself had already been handed to her, and she made a different decision every time it came up. Not out of ignorance, out of certainty that it wouldn't matter. For 6 years, that certainty held. Then it didn't.
It was June 14th, 2015, a Sunday, and the temperature in Lakewood, Ohio had reached 91 degrees by early afternoon. The community pool was open, occupied, and operating normally. Nothing about the day suggested a disruption beyond routine summer use. Deborah Foss, 54, had lived in the development for over 20 years and worked part-time at a local retail store. She held no HOA role, but frequently inserted herself into enforcement issues, filing 31 complaints in 18 months, none upheld. Residents described her as confrontational and controlling overshared spaces. She had mild hypertension, chronic plantar fasciitis, wore orthopedic sandals, and lived alone. The Washington family had moved in 8 months earlier. Renan, 38, was an electrician, and Nathania, 36, worked part-time at a pediatric clinic. They had 3 children, including 15-year-old Aaliyah. Their dues were current, with full access to amenities. Deborah filed 4 complaints against them, none upheld. Aaliyah began recording after repeated confrontations initiated by Deborah. The family arrived at the pool carrying towels and a cooler. Deborah was already seated near the entrance with a printed copy of the association bylaws, positioned to monitor entry. The pool was below its posted capacity. As the family approached, she stood immediately and moved to block the gate, placing herself directly in front of the latch. Without any authority, she told Renan that access needed to be confirmed and that the pool was at capacity. I didn't think much at first, but she got up so fast it felt like she'd been waiting for them, like the paper in her hand was already ready before they even reached the gate. Renan presented a valid membership card. Deborah examined it briefly and stated it appeared expired. She did not step aside. Instead, she remained fixed in place, continuing to assert control over entry. Other residents began watching. Deborah's voice grew louder as she repeated her claims, speaking over responses and preventing the situation from settling. Her posture became rigid. She maintained her position at the gate, using her body as a barrier. Renan remained measured and stated they were entering. When he reached toward the latch, Deborah reacted immediately, stepping forward and shoving him with both hands to the chest. The action was abrupt and not in response to any physical threat. Renan stepped backward onto the grass and maintained balance. He did not respond physically. Deborah remained at the gate, now standing on the narrow concrete drainage edge outside the entrance. The surface was wet from pool runoff and had a thin layer of algae. Her movement during the shove had shifted her weight forward beyond stable footing. Her left foot slipped outward, and her right foot failed to gain traction. her body tilted backward. She was still holding the printed bylaws in one hand and did not reposition to break the fall. The back of her head struck the rounded edge of the pool, coping with significant force. Her body continued into the water face down. She did not attempt to recover or surface. Within seconds, the water around her head began to discolor. At first, it just looked like she slipped under normally until the stillness in her body made it clear something was wrong. Renan entered the pool and lifted her, keeping her face above water while calling for help. A lifeguard reached them shortly after and assisted in bringing her to the deck. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was initiated. Aaliyah continued recording as bystanders moved back. Emergency responders arrived and continued advanced care. Deborah was transported without regaining consciousness and was later pronounced dead. The cause of death was blunt force traumatic brain injury. The impact created a depressed fracture at the back of the skull, driving bone fragments into critical brain structures and causing immediate loss of consciousness and breathing. She was non-viable before entering the water, with drowning considered secondary. The wet surface and low traction from her footwear also contributed to the outcome. For privacy, the recording was removed from circulation. The Homeowners Association later reached a settlement with the Washington family over the handling of repeated complaints and ongoing disputes. The pool entrance was updated with a non-slip surface, and signage was added indicating all residents were permitted access. It was July 22, 2016. A county fairground in Central Texas was packed for its annual two-day rodeo, the kind of event that draws the whole town out. Bleachers full, vendors lining the perimeter, kids running around with funnel cake. Loud, dusty, and hot. Temperatures that afternoon were sitting around 97 degrees Fahrenheit, and the arena floor was dry, packed dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Anna Holsk was 47 years old and worked in human resources for a mid-sized company in Austin. If you've ever met someone who treated every rule like a personal inconvenience designed specifically for them, that was Anna. She'd driven out to the fairground that afternoon with a co-worker and had already gotten into it with a parking attendant before they even made it through the gate. By the time they found their seats, she'd complained to two different volunteers about the seating arrangement and demanded to be moved closer to the arena floor. They told her the sections were assigned. She sat down, but she wasn't done. Rodeo arenas at county-level events are divided by a series of gates and fencing that separate spectator areas from the active competition floor. The gates closest to the arena are strictly off-limits during active events, not suggestions, actual hard barriers that exist, because the animals on that floor are unpredictable, and the space near the chutes is not safe during a ride. At this particular event, a single volunteer was managing the gate on the east side of the arena during active segment. About an hour into the event, a transition was happening between two riding segments. The volunteer managing the east gate had stepped about 15 feet away to help carry equipment to the other side of the arena. The gate was closed but unlatched, held in place by its own weight. That gap in coverage lasted maybe 2 minutes. Anna had been watching that gate. She'd already tried to get closer to the arena floor twice, once by asking a volunteer to let her through who refused, and once by leaning over the railing for a better photo angle before being told to step back. When she saw the volunteer step away, she moved immediately. She pushed the gate open, slipped through, and walked onto the dirt floor about 20 feet from the active chute area, phone out like she'd earned it. What she didn't know was that the next segment had already been cued. A 1,100-pound quarter horse that had been agitated in the chute for several minutes was released seconds after she stepped onto the floor. The rider was thrown within the first few seconds, which left the horse loose with no handler in immediate reach. A loose, agitated horse in an enclosed arena with an unfamiliar figure standing in the open is going to react, and it did. It veered sharply toward her at full gallop. She had no time to move. The horse struck her with its chest and right shoulder, knocked her off her feet, and sent her into the arena fencing at the perimeter. She hit the lower metal rail at the back of her head and upper neck. She didn't get up. The horse was corralled by arena staff within about 30 seconds. Workers reached her within a minute. She was unresponsive, no movement. Emergency services were called immediately and arrived within about 9 minutes given the fairground's proximity to town. No pulse on arrival. Resuscitation was attempted on scene and continued en route, but it didn't matter. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner confirmed traumatic brain injury as the cause of death from blunt force impact, with a cervical fracture at C2 as a contributing factor. The horse strike caused the fall, but the fatal injuries came from hitting that fence rail. Death would have been near instantaneous from the cervical fracture alone. The volunteer was cleared. Witness accounts and security footage confirmed he'd stepped away briefly for a legitimate reason, and that Anna had pushed through a closed gate without authorization. Anna's co-worker confirmed her repeated attempts to access the arena floor throughout the afternoon. No negligence found on the part of the event or its staff. Ruled an accidental death. Closed within 6 weeks.
It was March 3rd, 2016, in Memphis, Tennessee. The early afternoon was clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 40s and a wind coming off the river. Downtown streets were busy with a steady mix of locals and visitors on weekends. Olivia Fitch, 43, was a customer service supervisor at a call center outside Memphis. Her co-workers described her as difficult to redirect once she had made up her mind about something, and quick to interpret any challenge to her judgment as disrespect. She had driven downtown that afternoon with her teenage daughter for lunch and a walk along the riverfront. While returning to her car in a nearby surface parking lot, she realized her phone was no longer in her purse. She retraced her steps mentally and became certain she had left it at the restaurant 2 blocks away. She called it from her daughter's phone. It rang, and then someone answered briefly before hanging up. She concluded immediately that someone had stolen it and muttered that people had no respect anymore, adding that she wasn't about to let someone just take her property. She opened a tracking app on her daughter's phone and saw the location indicator moving steadily along a nearby road, consistent with slow vehicle traffic. Rather than calling the police, Olivia decided she would handle it herself. She told her daughter to stay near the car and not move. She moved quickly toward the road, eyes fixed on the moving location indicator. The tracking app showed the phone continuing north at a steady pace, consistent with slow-moving vehicle traffic. A rideshare vehicle that had been sitting at a light near the parking lot exit began pulling forward, accelerating gradually as it merged into the lane. Olivia had spotted someone in the back seat holding a phone and had already decided that it was hers. She stepped off the curb and moved alongside the passenger side as the vehicle began accelerating through slow traffic. Drivers behind the rideshare tapped their brakes, unsure why a woman was moving into the lane. Olivia shouted toward the rear window, insisting the phone was hers. As the car reached approximately 15 miles per hour, she grabbed the rear door handle with one hand and struck the side of the vehicle with the other, demanding the passenger open the door. She reached toward the partially lowered rear window and thrust her arm inside, attempting to grab the phone directly. The driver, startled by the sudden movement alongside the vehicle, braked hard. Olivia had no stable footing and had not secured her grip on the doorframe. The abrupt stop threw her backward. Her hand slipped free, and she fell onto the road surface, striking the back of her head against the asphalt. The impact caused pedestrians on the sidewalk to turn immediately. The vehicle came to a stop, and the driver and passenger exited as traffic behind them halted. The passenger, a college student, had found the phone on the sidewalk outside the restaurant and had been attempting to identify the owner when the call came through. He exited the vehicle holding the phone in plain view and later gave a statement to police. Bystanders on the sidewalk called 911. Olivia was on the ground and not moving. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Olivia sustained a severe traumatic brain injury and never regained consciousness. She was transported to a hospital and died later that evening. An autopsy determined the cause of death to be blunt force traumatic brain injury resulting from the fall. The manner of death was ruled accidental. Her 15-year-old daughter was released to a family member. The passenger returned the phone and cooperated with investigators. No charges were filed. It was June 11th, 2015, in Boca Raton, Florida. The afternoon shift at the salon on Palmetto Park Road was running the way it always did on a weekday. Every station occupied, dryers humming, Conversations layered over each other across the room. The schedule was tight, and the staff had learned to move through it without much margin for anything unexpected. Denise Halpern, 55, was a real estate agent who had been selling properties in Boca for 12 years. She was good at her job, and she knew it. Colleagues described her as sharp, driven, and used to getting things done on her terms. That evening, she had one of the biggest open house showings of her quarter, a 4-bedroom waterfront property that had been sitting on the market for 2 months. She had spent the week preparing the listing, arranging staging furniture, and sending personal invitations to her top buyer contacts. First impressions mattered at a showing like this, and she intended to walk through that door, looking like someone who had everything under control. She had called ahead and booked a last-minute blowout, arriving at the salon at 4:10 in a cream blazer with her phone already in her hand and 45 minutes built into her schedule before she needed to leave. And look, I want to be clear about something. Denise was not an unreasonable person. She was under genuine pressure that evening. But then again, Karens don't know where to stop. The receptionist told her there was a 20-minute delay. The previous appointment had run over and her stylist was finishing up. Denise did not sit down. She asked why a booked appointment was being pushed back for someone who had gone over their time. The receptionist explained that the previous client had arrived late and the schedule had shifted. Denise said that was not her problem. She had a showing at 7, and she had booked specifically to have enough time. The receptionist said the stylist would be with her as soon as possible. Denise asked to speak with the manager. The manager came out and offered the same explanation. Denise said she understood the explanation and did not find it acceptable. A stylist working the next station over offered a compromise, suggesting she could begin the blowout while finishing the last steps of her current client. Denise agreed, though she made clear she expected the full service and expected it done properly. The blowout began. Within a few minutes, Denise was directing the process. She told the stylist the sectioning was wrong. She said the dryer felt too cold and was taking too long. The stylist explained the heat setting and said increasing it further risked damaging the hair. Denise said she had been getting blowouts for 20 years and she knew what her hair could handle. She reached up and adjusted the dryer controls herself, pushing the heat higher. The stylist moved her hand away from the controls and reset them. Denise adjusted them again. The stylist stopped working for a moment and said calmly that if the settings were changed again, she would not be able to continue the service safely. Denise told her to keep going. This is the part of the story I find hardest to sit with. Because the stylist tried, she said the words out loud, and Denise heard them and kept going anyway. Because of the constant adjustments and interruptions, the stylist had to reposition her setup to keep working, running a temporary extension cord from a nearby station. It passed behind the chair, close to where Denise had been shifting throughout the appointment. It was not part of the usual setup, but it allowed the service to continue under the conditions Denise insisted on. Denise's phone rang. She answered it and stepped back from the chair while talking, still complaining about the delay. She was moving without looking, distracted and mid-conversation. Her heel caught the extension cord. She lurched backward and reached for the chair, but missed. There was no break in the fall. Her full weight carried straight back, and the back of her head struck the lower metal frame behind her. The sound cut through the noise of the salon. What gets me about that moment is how fast it was. Staff called 911 immediately. Denise was conscious, but disoriented when paramedics arrived. Imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury from the direct impact. She was admitted to intensive care and died 3 days later without regaining full consciousness. Unfortunately, she never made it to the house showing. Investigators classified the incident as an accidental fall involving environmental obstruction and active client interference during the service. The incident was ruled accidental.
It was August 14, 2013. The afternoon heat settled thick over a residential neighborhood in Queens, New York, where a parking dispute outside a small shopping plaza would end in a way no one anticipated. Deborah Hines was a 44-year-old real estate working for a mid-sized property management in the borough. She had built a reputation over 12 years for closing deals aggressively and maintaining a demanding schedule that left little room for her driving record reflected 3 citations for aggressive driving and multiple complaints filed by other motorists, and at least 2 documented road rage incidents where police issued warning. Friends described her as fiercely independent but increasingly confrontational in public, particularly she felt disrespected. Real estate work in Queens required constant mobility between properties, often involving tight parking situations and competitive use of limited street space. Deborah drove a heavy SUV, which friends say she treated as an extension of her professional image and personal territory. The vehicle's size likely gave her confidence in traffic confrontations, and she had been known to use it intimidatingly during disputes, inching aggressively toward other cars or blocking driveways. That afternoon, Deborah arrived at a strip mall to meet a potential client. Another driver, a local resident, had just pulled into a spot Deborah believed she had been waiting for. Words were exchanged through car windows. The other driver refused to move, citing that they had reached the spot first. Witnesses reported Deborah becoming visibly agitated, gesturing angrily and revving her engine. Rather than finding another space in the half-empty lot, Deborah threw her SUV into reverse. Several bystanders standing near the plaza entrance stepped back slightly, but called out warnings as her vehicle accelerated backward faster than necessary. Posted signs clearly marked the canal's proximity, and the faded yellow parking blocks were visible behind her. She seemed to have ignored both the warnings and the physical barriers, and was likely focused entirely on her foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The SUV jumped the low concrete barrier and snapped through the weakened guardrail. The rear wheels left pavement, and the vehicle's momentum carried it over the edge. The front end lifted briefly before the entire SUV tipped backward the canal, with a heavy splash that sent water across the parking lot. The canal measured 8 to 10 feet deep at that section, its murky water filling the vehicle within 10 to 15 seconds. Witnesses watched Deborah struggle inside, her hands striking the windows as the SUV sank rear first and settled at a steep angle. The water pressure made door operation nearly impossible. She managed to partially lower the driver's window but could not squeeze through before the cabin flooded completely. Fire department dive teams arrived within 9 minutes following a bystander's call. By then, the SUV sat fully submerged, only its front hood visible above the waterline. Divers extracted Deborah's body several minutes later. Resuscitation attempts at the scene proved unsuccessful. The medical examiner determined drowning as the primary. Water was present in lung tissue. Secondary injuries included fractured ribs and severe bruising across the chest and limbs, consistent with violent impact against the steering wheel and door frame during the vehicle's descent and struggle. Deborah's estate entered lengthy insurance dispute, with carriers citing reckless operation. Her death became a case study in regional traffic safety reports, documenting aggressive driving consequences. Witness statements provided consistent accounts of the incident.
It was July 15th, 2016, when the humid Charleston evening air hung thick over the bustling waterfront district. The popular seafood restaurant was packed with tourists and locals alike, drawn by fresh catches and harbor views. Inside, the clatter of dishes mixed with animated conversations as servers weaved between crowded tables. Helena Morrow, a 50-year-old business owner known for her direct manner and impatience with what she considered unnecessary precautions, had arrived with 2 close friends for their monthly dinner gathering. Helena had built her company through decisive action and rarely second-guessed herself, traits that had served her well in business, but sometimes put her at odds with others' advice. Years earlier, Helena had been diagnosed with a severe shellfish allergy after an emergency room visit that required treatment. Her physician prescribed an epinephrine autoinjector and advised strict, lifelong avoidance of shellfish. Helena also had a documented history of asthma, a condition known to increase the severity of allergic reactions, though she rarely mentioned it and had not experienced a serious flare in years. When their server approached, standard allergy protocols were initiated. After Helena casually mentioned her prior allergy while asking about the shrimp special, the server clarified whether it was life-threatening. Upon learning she had once carried epinephrine, the server notified the manager. The manager reviewed the menu disclaimers, explained the risks, and recommended several non-shellfish alternatives. The kitchen stood ready to mark the order as an allergy alert if needed. Helena dismissed the concerns. She insisted she had likely outgrown the allergy and believed her earlier reaction had been exaggerated. When reminded she once carried epinephrine, Helena admitted she no longer kept one with her. Despite repeated offers to substitute her entree, she firmly stated she understood the risks and wanted the shrimp as prepared. The manager documented her refusal before allowing the order to proceed. The kitchen prepared the shrimp normally, and Helena began eating with visible satisfaction. Within minutes, she felt tingling around her lips and tightness in her throat. Assuming it was minor, she continued eating rather than stopping. The symptoms escalated quickly. Her voice grew hoarse, and swelling developed around her lips and eyes. She began coughing and wheezing, struggling to draw full breaths. Her asthma compounded the reaction, intensifying airway constriction. Over the next several minutes, her breathing became increasingly labored and audible, and she appeared flushed and disoriented. Staff recognized the severe allergic reaction and called 911 immediately. As Helena's condition worsened, she became dizzy and hypotensive, slumping forward in her chair. Paramedics arrived promptly and administered intramuscular epinephrine, oxygen, and additional medications for suspected anaphylaxis before transporting her to the nearest hospital. At the emergency department, physicians initiated aggressive treatment, including repeated epinephrine dosing and advanced airway management as swelling progressed. Despite rapid intervention, Helena developed severe anaphylactic shock that did not respond to repeated treatment, resulting in prolonged oxygen deprivation. Resuscitative efforts continued, but she did not recover. Helena was pronounced dead later that evening. The medical examiner confirmed her documented shellfish allergy and asthma through medical records. The official cause of death was listed as anaphylaxis due to shellfish exposure in a patient with underlying asthma. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The restaurant completed an incident report and cooperated with routine insurance and regulatory review. Documentation showed staff followed allergy protocols, offered alternatives, and recorded Helena's refusal of recommended precautions. Within days, operations returned to normal following routine regulatory review. It was June 7th, 2014, at a busy community farmers market in Milltown, New York, USA. Stalls displayed fresh produce, handmade goods, and live demonstrations, with crowds strolling past while organizers monitored safety and maintained vendor boundaries. Lenora Whitfield, 47, had built a carefully curated persona as a wellness influencer running a blog focused on clean and conscious living. Though her readership was mostly casual clicks, she lived in a renovated farmhouse with her passive husband, who rarely challenged her opinions to avoid conflict. Lenora held strong beliefs on food, parenting, and neighborhood aesthetics, and she treated public outings as performances for an imagined audience. She had a documented allergy to bee stings from a previous incident, but had neglected to keep her emergency medication current. Harlan Reed, 61, was a third-generation beekeeper who regularly operated at local markets in New York. His booth featured raw honey, beeswax products, and an enclosed observation hive, a transparent case holding a live colony. Harlan followed all safety regulations, wore protective gear during setup, and kept veils and gloves nearby. Observation hives are designed to keep bees calm and contained, but if the colony is disturbed, thousands of defensive insects can spill out at once. For most people, the stings would mean pain and swelling. For someone with a serious allergy, they could be deadly. Lenora approached Harlan's booth and immediately objected to the live bees, claiming they violated public safety. Harlan showed her proper permits for the display, but she dismissed them as fake and filmed the encounter for her blog, narrating the danger to bystanders. When Harlan turned to assist other customers, Lenora stepped past the vendor boundary and reached toward the observation hive, telling shoppers it was unsafe. A spare beekeeping veil had been left on the edge of Harlan's table, its strap looped loosely around the hive's transport frame. Lenora picked it up, mocking it for her video, but the strap caught on the frame, yanking the hive from the table. The box struck the asphalt, the ventilation screen popped open, and thousands of agitated bees immediately poured into the crowded market space. The first bees reached Lenora. Within seconds, they landed individually, stinging exposed skin rapidly. She received dozens of stings on her face, neck, and hands almost instantly. Her allergy triggered a massive histamine release, and her airway began closing within moments. She collapsed as her body went into shock, unable to call for help. Nearby, vendors began shouting for patrons to clear the area, while one bystander attempted basic first aid, but Lenora was unconscious. The bee colony remained defensive, continuing to sting anyone who remained close to the disturbed hive, adding more stings before emergency responders could establish a safe perimeter using smoke and protective equipment. Medical teams arrived within minutes, but Lenora was already in full anaphylactic shock, unresponsive, and without measurable blood pressure. She was rushed to a regional hospital in Milltown, where she was pronounced dead. The coroner determined the cause of death was anaphylactic shock, triggered by multiple bee stings. Her airway had closed rapidly, and cardiovascular collapse followed massive histamine release. Immediate epinephrine could have been life-saving, but none was available. Harlan was cleared of liability after surveillance footage and witness statements confirmed Lenora had handled his equipment without permission, despite repeated warnings. The incident led local market authorities to implement stricter safety protocols, including protective barriers around live animal displays and clearer signage. Lenora's blog was quietly removed weeks later by her husband, ending her public presence. It was October 2015 in Rutherford County, Tennessee. The fellowship hall was warm and brightly lit, the kind of room that always smells like coffee and folding tables regardless of what's being served. It was a mild fall afternoon, around 64 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and most members had driven short distances with their dishes already prepared. The hall had no commercial refrigeration. Dishes were held on warming trays or left at room temperature, the same setup the congregation had used for years without incident. Ann Ketterman was 58, a longtime church member who had gradually and informally taken control of the monthly potluck over a period of years. She had no food handling certification, no culinary training, nothing that would give her authority in any official sense. But she had presence, and she had been doing this long enough that people had stopped pushing back. Every dish got looked at before it hit the table. Every dish got an opinion. I've known people like Anne, not in a church context, but in offices, in group settings, where someone decides the rules should run through them first. It's a very specific kind of person, and I think most people have a face in their head right now. That month, a woman named Maureen Abels brought a green bean casserole. Maureen was 67 and had been a member of that congregation for over 2 decades. She had made the same dish, the same way, for years. Anne rejected it in front of other members. The texture was wrong. The temperature was off. She sent Maureen back to reheat it, then sent her back again, then directed her to scrap it and remake it using Anne's own instruction, which included a low, slow reheat in a covered dish that sat in the church kitchen for 2 hours before being brought back out. I want to be precise about that, because it's not incidental. It's the whole mechanism. Here's what I didn't fully understand until I went through the food safety documentation. Clostridium botulinum thrives in low-acid, low-oxygen environments. Exactly what you get inside a covered cream-based casserole repeatedly warmed and cooled without reaching a temperature high enough to neutralize it. Botulinum toxin is destroyed by sufficient heat. The original dish, prepared and served in a single pass, didn't create the same conditions for toxin development. The remake did. 2 hours in a covered dish on a low warmer can keep food in a temperature range where the toxin isn't destroyed, not hot enough to neutralize it, and not cold enough to slow bacterial activity. Nobody designed it that way. That's what makes it so hard to look away from. Anne was the first to serve herself from the final version. The potluck continued, and nobody reported feeling unwell that afternoon. That's consistent with how botulinum toxin, it doesn't present immediately. Between 18 and 36 hours later, Anne began experiencing fatigue and blurred vision. By the following day, she had difficulty swallowing and a drooping heaviness in her face and neck that moved downward through her limbs. She believed she had a stomach bug. By the time a family member found her unable to stand and called for help, The toxin had progressed to a point where early intervention was no longer straightforward. The detail that hits hardest when I go back through this is that Maureen ate from the original dish, so did at least one other member served before Anne intervened. Neither of them got sick. Health authorities tested both versions. The original returned clean. The remake did not. That result is documented. It's not ambiguous. Anne died in hospital care 4 days after the potluck. Confirmed cause was botulinum toxin poisoning. Food samples from both versions were tested and the findings were clear. Congregation members were interviewed, Maureen among them. No negligence was assigned to her. Everything in the remake had been done under Anne's direct instruction. The case closed without further action. The original dish was fine. I've read that finding several times, and I still don't quite know what to do with it. She rejected something that was fine, replaced it with something that wasn't, and was the first person to eat it.
It was May 12, 2018, and a shopping plaza in suburban Houston, Texas was operating at typical weekend capacity, with steady vehicle turnover, moderate pedestrian traffic, and full occupancy in the main parking rows. Nothing about the environment suggested anything beyond routine consumer activity. Vonda Strike, 49, lived a few miles from the plaza and worked part-time in administrative support for a local clinic. She had no reported medical conditions that affected mobility and was described by acquaintances as generally assertive in everyday interactions, particularly in public service settings. She was alone that afternoon, driving a mid-size SUV. The parking lot had a standard layout with marked stalls, a central driving lane, and concrete wheel stops separating vehicles from pedestrian walkways. Surveillance footage later showed consistent vehicle flow, with drivers circling for available spaces due to peak demand. A vehicle had just begun reversing out of a parking space near the front row when Vonda entered the lane behind it. At the same time, another driver had been waiting on the opposite side of the aisle, preparing to move into the newly vacated spot. Both vehicles signaled intent to occupy the same space within seconds of each other. Normally, one driver yields or pauses once the other vehicle commits to reversing, preventing anyone from entering the blind zone at the same time. Vonda exited her vehicle and immediately approached the rear of the reversing car, raising her voice and signaling that the space was already claimed. The driver, noticing her proximity, applied the brake and brought the vehicle to a complete stop to avoid further movement. The engine remained running, and the vehicle stayed partially angled within the lane. Instead of stepping away from the path of the vehicle, Vonda remained directly behind it, continuing the confrontation. She moved backward incrementally as she spoke, maintaining eye contact with the other driver while gesturing toward the space, and refusing repeated attempts by the driver to disengage and continue reversing away. The rear wheels of the vehicle were positioned near a slight elevation change between the driving lane and the pedestrian curb edge. As the argument continued, Vonda shifted her weight backward without checking her footing. Her heel made contact with the raised concrete divider separating the lane from the sidewalk. She lost balance instantly as her heel caught the raised edge of the concrete wheel stop behind her. With her weight already shifted backward mid-step, there was no stable point to recover her footing. Her upper body tilted sharply in a continuous motion, driven by momentum rather than control, and she began to fall straight back toward the pavement. That split second is where everything stops being reversible, and there's no time left to correct positioning. As she went down, her head remained unprotected, with no reflexive movement to brake or slow the impact. The back of her skull struck the concrete wheel stop at close range, creating a direct, concentrated point of contact. The force of the impact was immediate, and her body followed through onto the ground without interruption. She collapsed fully onto the pavement and did not regain responsiveness, remaining motionless in the position where she fell. Bystanders called emergency services immediately. Nearby individuals moved to assist, but she remained unconscious at the scene. Paramedics arrived within minutes and initiated advanced medical response before transporting her to hospital care. Despite intervention, imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury from blunt force impact to the occipital region, resulting in catastrophic internal damage and rapid loss of neurological function. She did not regain consciousness. The incident review, based on witness statements and surveillance footage, confirmed the fall occurred during active verbal escalation while she remained positioned within a vehicle's reversing path and adjacent curb boundary. A routine parking dispute escalates into a brief standoff in a crowded lot, where positioning becomes the critical factor in what follows, before the next case shifts into a different environment involving controlled mechanical systems under human interference. It was March 3rd, 2015, a mid-rise apartment complex in suburban Ohio. Just a regular Tuesday evening. People coming home from work, TVs on, dinner being made. The kind of building where you know your neighbors just enough to nod at them in the hallway. Nothing about that night looked unusual from the outside. If you asked anyone in that building about Creetha Solm, 51, you'd get the same answer. She had a complaint about everything. The parking lot, the hallway lighting, the way other tenants let their doors close too hard. 6 years in that building, and she'd managed to have a problem with just about everyone in it at some point. That evening, she'd come home already wound up after getting into it with a group of neighborhood kids she was convinced had been messing with her car in the parking lot. She'd screamed at them, threatened to call their parents, and stormed upstairs feeling like she'd won something. That mood is important. What she had no idea about was that a gas line servicing her floor had developed a slow leak earlier that day. Maintenance had been notified, and a written notice had been slipped under her door that afternoon. Stay out of your unit until the line gets inspected. One piece of paper standing between her and what was about to happen. She never read it. Coming off that confrontation downstairs, still fuming, she spotted the folded notice on the floor just inside her doorway and immediately assumed the kids had shoved it under her door as payback. She picked it up, crumpled it without opening it, and tossed it toward the trash can. Didn't even hesitate. Natural gas is treated to have a strong, rotten egg smell, so leaks are easy to catch. But Creetha regularly burned scented candles in her apartment and had left some going earlier that day. The lingering scent likely masked the gas. By the time she walked in, it had already been building inside the unit for hours. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and decided she was going to run herself a bath. She'd had a long day, she'd dealt with those kids, and as far as she was concerned, she deserved to unwind. She went to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and reached for her aromatherapy candles on the shelf, the ones she lit specifically to decompress. She struck a match. The gas concentration in the unit had been sitting well within the explosive range for hours at that point. One flame was all it took. The explosion tore through the bathroom and the adjoining wall, blew out the exterior window, and partially collapsed the floor between her unit and the one below. 2 floors down, people felt it. Neighbors called for emergency services within minutes. Responders arrived about 8 minutes later. The fire that followed was contained relatively quickly, but her unit was almost completely destroyed. She was found in the bathroom, directly at the ignition point. The injuries were what you'd expect from that kind of proximity to a gas explosion. Severe blast trauma to the torso and head, full-thickness burns across her upper body, and blunt force injuries from the structural collapse around her. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as combined blast trauma and thermal burns with contributing injuries from structural debris. The gas leak was confirmed to have originated from a corroded fitting on the supply line servicing her floor, a legitimate maintenance issue that had been caught and flagged that same day. The crumpled notice was recovered from her trash can, still unread, and logged as evidence. The match used for ignition was recovered near the blast origin point. The case was ruled an accidental death. Maintenance records confirmed the notice had been delivered to her unit that afternoon. No negligence was found on the part of building management. The neighboring unit sustained significant structural damage, but its occupant wasn't home at the time, closed within 2 months.
It was July 14, 2017, in Chicago, Illinois. The rooftop bar sat on the 9th floor of a converted warehouse in the West Loop with a wraparound terrace and waist-high glass barrier panel framed in black steel. Melissa Corin, 34, was a marketing consultant. She was particular about her image and quick to argue when she felt a rule was being applied to her unnecessarily. People who knew her described her as someone who needed to feel ahead of things, ahead of trends, ahead of other people. A former colleague once said, Melissa had a way of deciding in advance that she was the exception to whatever was being asked of her. She arrived that evening with a friend. The two of them had talked about visiting the bar for almost a year, passing the idea back and forth until they finally picked a date. It had been on both of their lists for a long time, and Melissa wanted a photo that did the view justice. She ordered drinks at the outdoor bar and spent the first 20 minutes circling the terrace. She repeatedly rejected angles that didn't frame the skyline the way she wanted. Each attempt seemed to frustrate her more. She repositioned chairs, stepped into walkways, and asked her friend to retake the photo several times. Nearby guests began glancing over as her voice carried across the terrace. Small signs posted near the entrance and along the perimeter stated that guests were not permitted to lean over the railing or stand on furniture. Melissa eventually settled on the northwest corner, where the skyline framing was cleanest. She leaned her phone over the top of the barrier to get the height in the shot. A staff member approached and asked her not to lean over the barrier, explaining it was a safety policy. Melissa responded loudly enough for people at neighboring tables to hear, arguing that the glass reached her waist and that she wasn't doing anything unsafe. He asked her to step back. She shook her head and turned toward the skyline again. When he stepped away briefly, she climbed onto a cushioned bench near the corner. The added height dropped the barrier to mid-thigh, leaving open air above it. Her friend, standing a few feet away, told her to get down. A couple seated near the railing looked over as Melissa waved a hand dismissively and continued adjusting her stance. The staff member returned and instructed her to step off the bench immediately. Melissa replied that she was almost done and held up one finger without looking at him. He repeated the instruction. She turned slightly toward him, saying the bar was being overly cautious, and as she gestured backward with her right arm, her heel pressed deeper into the cushion behind her. The cushion shifted under her weight. Her left foot slid and her upper body tipped forward. By the time she reached for the top rail, she was already too far over the edge to recover. She went over the barrier and fell from the 9th floor terrace to the alley below. Emergency services arrived within minutes. She was transported to a nearby hospital with injuries that were not survivable. She was pronounced dead that evening. An autopsy later determined the cause of death to be multiple blunt force injuries sustained in the fall. The manner of death was ruled accidental. Her friend was treated on scene for shock. The staff member, who had twice asked Melissa to step down, gave a statement to responding officers. The bar closed the rooftop terrace for the remainder of the week. Following the incident, the ownership group removed the bench seating from the perimeter zone entirely and installed secondary cable barriers set 18 inches inward from the glass panel. Staff were given updated guidance on escalating safety interventions to management rather than continuing one-on-one conversations when a guest refused to comply. It was March 6, 2015, in Beaver Creek, Ohio. The afternoon shift at the grocery store on Fairfield Road was winding down the way it always did at that hour, the checkout lanes thinning out, the overhead lights humming over empty conveyor belts. It was the kind of afternoon where nothing was supposed to happen. Sharon Whitaker, 54, was a substitute teacher at an elementary school in the district. Friends and colleagues described her as someone who did not let things go. She was the kind of person who read the fine print, kept her receipts, and followed up on every complaint she ever filed. She was organized, and she was persistent, and she believed strongly that if something was wrong, it was worth saying so. That afternoon, she had driven to the store to pick up supplies for her daughter's birthday party the following weekend. Her daughter was turning 9, and Sharon had been planning the party for 2 weeks. She had a list, balloons in the colors her daughter had asked for, a chocolate cake mix and the frosting to go with it, paper plates and napkins, and a bag of candy for the party games. She had worked it all out, and she knew roughly what it was going to cost. And look, this is just a mom trying to give her daughter a good birthday. That is the full context of why she was in that store. A few weeks earlier, she had clipped a coupon from the Sunday Circular. It was for a few dollars off a grocery purchase over a certain amount, and she had held on to it in the small zippered pocket of her purse specifically for this trip. She was not going to pay full price when she had a coupon. That was not how Sharon Whitaker did things. She loaded her items onto the belt, set her purse on the small ledge at the end of the register, and placed the coupon face up next to her loyalty card. The cashier picked it up, scanned it, and set it back down on the belt. The coupon had expired 3 weeks earlier. Sharon looked at it. She told the cashier that she had clipped it recently and that the store should honor it. The cashier explained that the system would not accept an expired coupon and that there was nothing she could do. Sharon asked for a manager. The cashier called for one over the intercom. While they waited, Sharon told the cashier that a little flexibility would go a long way, and that this was exactly the kind of thing that made people stop shopping at certain stores. The cashier kept her eyes on the register, and this is the part where I keep thinking, just leave the items, just walk out. But that was not Sharon. The manager arrived a few minutes later. He was a man in his early 30s with a store lanyard and a patient expression that Sharon apparently did not find reassuring. He looked at the coupon. He confirmed it was expired. Sharon said the expiration date was printed so small that a person would need a magnifying glass to read it, and that this was a store problem, not a customer problem. She told him she had been shopping at this location for 11 years. She told him she spent a significant amount of money there every month. He offered her a small discount on a future purchase as a goodwill gesture. Sharon said that was not the same as honoring the coupon, and she did not accept it. She asked for the name of the shift supervisor. The manager stepped away from the register to make a phone call. Several minutes passed. The customers who had been waiting behind Sharon had quietly moved to other lanes. She remained where she was. When the manager came back, the answer was the same. The coupon could not be accepted. Sharon took a pen from her purse and wrote the supervisor's name on the back of the coupon. She told the manager that corporate would be hearing from her. She left her items on the belt and walked toward the exit. On her way out, she told the cashier that some people had no business working with the public. The entrance to the store had been mopped as part of routine floor cleaning during the late afternoon lull. A yellow wet floor sign had been placed in the center of the walkway, just inside the sliding doors. Sharon had walked straight through it on her way out, kicking it aside with her foot without slowing down, muttering that it was in the way. The sign tipped and came to rest at an angle near the edge of the mat. The floor was still wet. The sign was no longer centered in the walkway. What gets me is that she had already won the argument in her head before she even reached the door. She was done. She was leaving. And then something made her turn around. Sharon came back through the sliding doors just as immediately as she left. She had thought of something else she wanted to say. She came in fast, already talking, her eyes on the register at the far end of the lane. Her left foot came down on the damp tile, just past the entrance mat. The sole of her shoe found no grip on the wet surface. Her foot went forward and her body went straight back. She had no time to react and nothing to grab onto. The back of her head struck the tile floor directly. The sound carried to the nearest checkout lane. She did not move after that. Staff called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Sharon unresponsive near the entrance. She was transported to a medical center where imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury from the impact. She was admitted to intensive care. Sharon Whitaker died 2 days later without regaining consciousness. Her daughter's birthday party was never held that weekend. Investigators classified the incident as an accidental fall involving a displaced safety warning in a recently cleaned area. The incident was determined to be accidental.
It was June 22, 2015. The lobby of a mid-tier business hotel in Orlando, Florida, gleamed with polished Italian marble flooring. The afternoon heat had driven guests inside, where air conditioning battled the humidity that construction workers tracked in pool renovation. Cynthia Moraes, a 46-year-old regional for a national pharmaceutical distribution, had built her career on aggressive negotiation and an unwavering belief in her own importance. Her performance reviews consistently noted her results-driven approach, though Human Resources had fielded 17 complaints about her treatment of subordinate and service staff over 3 years. They described her as someone who viewed courtesy as weakness and compromise as failure. Her management style relied heavily on public confrontation and escalating situations until she received preferential treatment. That afternoon, Cynthia arrived expecting immediate processing despite holding a standard reservation. The front desk clerk explained that her room would be ready within minutes and asked her to wait briefly while they completed final preparation. The 3-minute delay triggered an explosive response. Hotel check-in procedures typically require 5 to 8 minutes during busy periods, a time frame Cynthia found unacceptable. She demanded an immediate upgrade, her voice escalating as other guests watched uncomfortably. The housekeeping supervisor had placed multiple wet floor signs along the marble pathway leading from the entrance to the front desk, clearly visible barriers that most guests navigated carefully. Cynthia ignored them entirely, focused on her confrontation with increasingly uncomfortable staff member. She grabbed an oversized luggage cart, maneuvering it aggressively through the lobby while continuing her tirade about unacceptable service standards. The cart's front wheel caught in a seam between marble tiles, causing a sudden backward pull. Her leather-soled stiletto heels found no traction on the water-slicked marble. She stepped directly into a wet section, her momentum carrying her forward as both feet lost purchase simultaneously. The heavy luggage cart offered no stability as she fell backward, her body twisting as she attempted to catch herself. Cynthia struck a protruding granite counter ledge roughly 42 inches high with the back of her head at full falling velocity. The impact was devastating. Witnesses heard a heavy thud against the counter, and a long scalp laceration along the occiput produced visible blood pooling on the marble. Unconsciousness came in. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, showing clear signs of severe neurological trauma. The front desk clerk activated emergency protocols within seconds, calling emergency services immediately. 2 hotel guests with medical training attempted jaw thrust maneuvers, applied direct pressure to the scalp wound, delivered supplemental oxygen, and held manual cervical stabilization. EMS arrived, though the severity of it largely. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes, finding Cynthia unresponsive, obvious skull fracture, and massive. She was transported to a regional trauma center, intubated en route, but never regained consciousness. The medical examiner determined death resulted from severe blunt force trauma, causing a basilar skull fracture, subdural hematoma, and catastrophic brain swelling. Hotel management reviewed security footage confirming Cynthia had bypassed 4 separate wet floor warnings before the accident. Staff members from other hotels reported her history of similar confrontational behavior to be a stay. Her funeral 3 days later drew a modest, primarily colleagues fulfilling professional obligations rather than personal connections formed through years of caustic.
It was November 17th, 2016, in Amarillo, Texas. A cold front had pushed through the panhandle that afternoon, dropping temperatures into the low 40s. By early evening, a neighborhood supermarket glowed under fluorescent lighting as employees prepared for closing. Brenda Harlow, 47, arrived shortly after sunset to pick up groceries for the week. She lived in a gated subdivision and served on her homeowners association board. Former co-workers described her as organized and persistent, especially when challenging policies she believed were flexible. In retail settings, she often escalated minor inconveniences into formal complaints. That evening, she wore a thick winter coat, leggings, and open-toed sandals. While selecting frozen vegetable and packaged meals, she fixated on glare, reflecting off the glass doors, and loudly accused the store of misleading presentation because she could not clearly read labels. A clerk explained that extra stock was kept in a staff-only walk-in freezer. Brenda demanded access, insisting she had a right to inspect unopened cases herself and threatening to contact corporate. The shift supervisor refused, citing safety rules and liability. Brenda photographed his name tag and announced she would report the store for unsafe customer conditions. Moments later, as an employee pushed a pallet jack through the stockroom doors, Brenda slipped in behind him without authorization. Surveillance later confirmed she entered the restricted area alone. The walk-in freezer measured roughly 12 by 14 feet and operated at about -5 degrees Fahrenheit. The insulated door was self-closing and equipped with a required interior safety release designed to open from the inside. Several large boxes had been stacked near the doorway, partially limiting clear access to the release plate. After the door sealed shut, Brenda turned and struck it with her palm. She reached for the interior release, but had to maneuver around the stacked boxes to apply pressure. As she shifted her footing, Frost near the threshold caused her sandal to slip. She fell backward and struck the back of her head against a metal storage rack. Surveillance footage showed her sitting upright for nearly a minute before standing unsteadily. She reached again for the release. Without gloves, her exposed hands struggled to maintain sustained pressure while repositioning around the boxes. Twice, she appeared to press the mechanism, but did not hold it long enough to disengage the latch. Investigators later confirmed the release functioned properly when unobstructed and fully depressed. Over the next hour, her movements became slower and less coordinated. Investigators later noted that prolonged exposure at that temperature would steadily impair coordination and judgment. Combined with the earlier head injury, her ability to operate the release mechanism likely deteriorated. She alternated between attempts to stand and periods seated against the shelving, remaining in contact with the cold concrete floor. Nearly 2 hours after entry, surveillance showed her lowering to the floor within a few feet of the door and remaining there. By the time an overnight stalker entered more than 2 hours after she went inside, Brenda was unresponsive. Emergency responders pronounced her dead at the scene. During autopsy, the medical examiner documented a 2-inch scalp laceration and findings consistent with a mild concussion. The injury was not fatal, but was determined to have contributed to temporary disorientation and slowed reaction time during the exposure. The official report listed accidental hypothermia as the cause of death, with head injury noted as a contributing factor. Core temperature in the low 80s Fahrenheit was consistent with prolonged exposure. Store management later received a safety citation for partially obstructing the interior release and improper storage. No criminal charges were filed. It was July 15, 2019, at a large, colorful hot spring in a major national park. Steam rose from near boiling pools, surrounded by vivid orange and yellow bacterial mats, and wooden boardwalks threaded through the area, crowded with tourists. Signs warned visitors of fragile crusts that could collapse into scalding water, and rangers patrolled to monitor safety. Evelyn Carrington, 47, had built her life around ambition and control. A high-powered real estate agent specializing in luxury properties, she rarely took vacations without her phone and expected the world to bend to her will. She drove a sleek white SUV with a vanity plate reading Soldit and believed rules applied only to others, while her tax contributions entitled her to special privileges. Her husband stayed at a nearby rental to golf, leaving Evelyn to supervise their 2 teenage children, who were embarrassed by her loud, confrontational behavior. Wearing pristine designer hiking boots and carrying a high-end camera she barely knew how to operate, Evelyn approached the hot spring, confident she could navigate both nature and protocol on her own terms. The park's boardwalks were designed to protect visitors and preserve the fragile thermal ecosystem beneath. The spring itself stretched more than 350 feet across, with water temperatures capable of causing third-degree burns in seconds. Multiple warning signs indicated the danger of stepping off the walkways, noting that the colorful bacterial mats covered fragile mineral crusts. Rangers carried specialized rescue equipment, trained to respond quickly to any thermal emergency. The confrontation began when a ranger noticed Evelyn's 14-year-old daughter stepping onto the bacterial mat to take a photo. Evelyn immediately challenged the ranger, insisting that her family deserved broader access and ignoring repeated requests to return to the boardwalk. She approached aggressively, gesturing with her camera, while nearby tourists filmed the escalating encounter. Spotting what she considered the perfect photo opportunity, Evelyn moved toward a section where the boardwalk curved away from the water's edge, leaving roughly 8 feet of bacterial mat between her and the boiling pool. She ignored the nearby rangers' repeated warnings and stepped over the safety rope, confident the surface beneath her boots was solid. The brilliant orange and yellow mats glistened in the morning sun, giving the illusion of stability, but beneath them lay a dangerously thin mineral crust. Each step she took made a faint cracking sound that went unnoticed amid the chatter of other tourists. After only a few steps, the crust suddenly gave way beneath her left foot. Evelyn plunged thigh-deep into the scalding water, the heat immediately searing her skin. Instinctively, she reached out with her hands to try and pull herself up, but the water burned her wrists and forearms almost instantly, sending her into shock. Pain and thermal shock overwhelmed her senses, and within seconds, she lost consciousness, her body floating face down. Emergency medical teams airlifted Evelyn to a regional medical center, where she was pronounced dead. The coroner determined drowning secondary to thermal shock as the cause of death, with massive burns contributing. Her core body temperature had spiked dangerously, and the thermal water had caused immediate loss of consciousness, preventing self-rescue. Survival was impossible under the circumstances. Evelyn's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the park, claiming insufficient safety measures. The case was dismissed after video evidence clearly showed her deliberate disregard for warnings and safety protocols. The incident prompted park authorities to enhance safety measures around thermal areas, adding extra signage and barriers to prevent similar tragedies. It was September 2017 in Horry County, South Carolina. The evening was warm, clear enough to keep the windows open, and somewhere in a residential kitchen, a phone was propped on a cutting board with a ring light aimed at the counter. A live stream was already running, and the comment section had started filling up almost immediately. And I want you to hold that detail because it becomes important later. Deborah Lynn Coulter was 43, a stay-at-home property owner with no culinary training and no background in food science or toxicology. What she did have was a reputation in her neighborhood for filing complaints, noise violation, exotic animal ordinances, anything she believed warranted official attention. I mention that not to reduce her to it, but because it's part of understanding why a Brave Foods challenge was the kind of thing she wanted to do on camera. She had something to prove about her own nerve, and she'd been promoting the stream for days. The fish she purchased was a fresh puffer fish from a private online seller, with no certification or preparation guidance. The listing described the fish as pre-clean. Based on what investigators found in that kitchen, it wasn't. And here's the thing I kept coming back to. You can find the basic facts about pufferfish toxicity in about 4 minutes online. Tetrodotoxin is concentrated in the liver, the skin, the ovaries, and the intestines. Licensed fugu chefs train for years to remove those organs without contaminating the flesh. That information is not buried. It is not technical. It is the first thing that comes up. I don't know what Deborah read before she bought the fish, but based on what she did next, it wasn't that. She began preparation on camera without removing the internal organs first. Her knife passed through the body cavity. Within the first 20 minutes, she ate a portion of the flesh. Nothing happened immediately, and I think that's one of the cruelest things about tetrodotoxin. It doesn't announce itself right away. It gives you just enough time to feel like you were right. The comment section was already filling with warnings. The messages were not vague. People were being specific, naming the toxin, explaining exactly why what she was doing was dangerous. Deborah read several of them on camera, dismissed them, and began blocking users. That's the detail I keep coming back to. More than the fish, more than the preparation, the blocking. Because those weren't trolls. Those were people who knew something she didn't, trying to reach her in real time, and she treated it like interference. Around the 25-minute mark, the recording shows her describing numbness in her lips, framing it as the fish being intense rather than anything wrong, still performing. And I have to be honest, that part is hard to sit with because you can see exactly where this is going, and she clearly cannot. By the 30-minute mark, her speech had slurred, and she set her fork down. A glass came off the counter around the 35-minute mark. She didn't catch it. By the 45-minute mark, the camera was still running, but Deborah was no longer visible, and there was no more sound. I want to be precise about what tetrodotoxin does because it matters for understanding how narrow the window for survival actually is. TTX blocks the nerve signals that tell your muscles to contract, including the diaphragm, which controls breathing. There is no antidote. The only intervention is ventilatory support started before respiratory failure sets in, and without rapid medical intervention, survival becomes unlikely. Deborah was alone in her kitchen. Nobody in that comment section could do anything except watch. A viewer contacted emergency services after the stream had been silent for several minutes. Responders found Deborah unresponsive and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was confirmed as tetrodotoxin poisoning leading to respiratory failure. The recording was preserved before the platform removed it. Purchase records from the vendor were recovered. No criminal liability was assigned. The purchase was made willingly from an unregulated source. I've thought about that more than I expected to. Nobody was charged. A vendor with no certification sold a product with no preparation guidelines and walked away clean. That's how the case closed.
It was July 18th, 2014, and the back patio of a house on a residential street in Roswell, Georgia, was being used for routine food preparation for a small catering job. The evening was warm and quiet, and the setting was otherwise ordinary for residential use. Patrice Dunham, 52, had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and served on an architectural review committee where she frequently submitted objections regarding landscaping, fencing, and outdoor decor. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper and had no elected authority within the community. I don't think it takes official power for people to start acting like they have it. Over the previous year, she had filed multiple complaints against a neighboring family regarding noise, parking, and alleged violations related to home-based business activity, all of which had been dismissed. She had also been formally asked to stop directly confronting residents after repeated disputes. She had a known severe allergy to tree nuts and carried emergency medication for it, which she was aware was critical in exposure situations. The Nguyen family operated a permitted home catering business specializing in Vietnamese cuisine. That evening, they were preparing a dessert that included crushed walnuts as an ingredient. The food preparation area was set up in the backyard, with ingredients organized on a table. Family members were present in different parts of the home, with the catering work ongoing and undisturbed prior to the incident. Patrice entered the property through an unlocked side gate without prior notice or invitation. She began recording and verbally stating that she was documenting what she believed to be a violation of community rules. She approached the food preparation area despite being told to leave. Her behavior escalated from observation to direct interference as she engaged with the ingredients on the table. She picked up a bowl containing crushed walnuts and handled it while continuing to record. When instructed again to stop and leave the property, she remained focused on documenting the scene. She then touched the contents directly with her fingers and brought them close to her face, continuing to speak as she handled the bowl. In the process, she transferred residue from her fingers to her mouth and lips. For individuals with severe sensitivity, even small amounts introduced this way can trigger a rapid and life-threatening reaction. Shortly after the contact, she began showing signs of distress. Her speech became interrupted, and she indicated that something was wrong. Visible swelling developed around her lips and face within moments. She retrieved emergency medication from her bag, but struggled to use it effectively. During the escalation of symptoms, others present attempted to assist. Even when help is right there, execution under panic is a completely different situation. The medication was ultimately administered after a short delay, but the reaction continued to progress. Emergency services were contacted and arrived within minutes. She was conscious but in severe respiratory distress with restricted airflow and rapidly declining oxygen levels. She was treated on site, transported for advanced care, and remained in intensive care but did not regain neurological function. Life support was later withdrawn. The cause of death was anaphylactic shock from exposure to tree nut allergens, involving rapid airway constriction, vascular collapse, and reduced oxygen delivery to vital organs. Medical evaluation noted that the delayed use of emergency medication contributed to the outcome, though symptoms had already reached a critical stage before effective intervention. Authorities reviewed the incident and found no grounds for charges. The catering operation was confirmed to be compliant with local regulations, and prior complaints against the property had been previously dismissed, leading to case closure. It was February 11th, 2017. A small nail and beauty salon in a strip mall in suburban Georgia was having a slow Saturday afternoon, the kind of place that does walk-ins, runs a few tanning beds in the back, and knows most of its regulars by name. 2 staff on shift, a handful of clients. Nothing unusual about the day until around 2:30 p.m. Feda Solis was 43 years old and worked as a property manager for a residential complex in the same suburb, the kind of job that gave her just enough authority over other people to make her insufferable everywhere else. She wasn't a regular at the salon, but she'd been in enough times that the staff knew her name and her reputation. She had a history of demanding discounts, complaining about wait time, and had once left a written complaint at the front desk because a technician had been too quiet during her appointment. That kind of person. That Saturday, she came in without an appointment and asked to use the salon's industrial tanning bed, a commercial-grade unit in the back that ran at significantly higher UV output and internal temperature than a standard consumer bed. The salon's policy was straightforward. The industrial unit required a trained technician present for the entire session to monitor exposure time and the client's condition. No exception. The staff member at the front explained the policy. Feda told her it was unnecessary, that she'd used tanning beds her whole life, and that the policy was discriminatory. She demanded a manager. The senior staff member came out and said the exact same thing. Feda told her she didn't need a babysitter, accused them both of targeting her specifically, and threatened to report the salon for refusing service, loud enough that the waiting area had gone completely quiet. The senior staff member, worn down and not wanting it in front of everyone, caved, agreed to let Feda use the unit with check-ins every 15 minutes. Feda was shown to the back room and given the rundown. 12 minutes max, don't touch the settings, call out if anything feels off. She nodded like she had better things to think about. Before getting in, Feda adjusted the external control panel on the unit, cranking the UV intensity and the session timer well above the recommended level. The controls were on the outside of the bed, accessible before the session started. She apparently decided that more output meant faster results. Then she got in and fell asleep. The first check-in came at 15 minutes. The staff member knocked, cracked the door, asked if everything was okay. Feda told her to get out and stop hovering. Door pulled shut. The second check-in was due 15 minutes later, but 2 walk-ins arrived at the front at the same time. And once things settled, the staff member stepped out briefly to grab lunch from 2 doors down. Feda had already responded fine once. She assumed that was still the case. What nobody accounted for was that Feda had fallen asleep inside the unit, which had been running above its recommended settings for close to an hour at that point. Industrial tanning beds generate significant heat buildup at normal settings. At elevated output, that heat accumulates faster than the body can regulate, especially in someone who's unconscious and not moving. She never woke up. When the staff member returned, she got no response to her knock, opened the door, and found Feda unresponsive. Emergency services were called immediately and arrived within about 7 minutes. No pulse on arrival. Resuscitation was attempted on scene and continued en route, but it didn't matter. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner listed cause of death as cardiac arrest, secondary to severe hyperthermia. Prolonged exposure at the elevated settings had driven her core temperature high enough to trigger fatal arrhythmia, accelerated heart rate, circulatory collapse. No recovery. The external control panel log confirmed the settings had been changed from their defaults before she got in. 2 check-ins were documented, one refused by Feda herself. The staff member was reviewed, but with the client's own tampering, and her refusal of the first check-in, direct negligence couldn't be established. Ruled an accidental death, closed within 3 months.
It was March 12, 2017. The Dubai desert stretched endlessly under a cloudless afternoon sky, the sand dunes glowing golden in temperatures reaching 95 degrees. Stephanie Bardot, a 34-year-old luxury lifestyle consultant, stood beside a dune buggy, a popular desert safari insisting she could handle the despite never having driven one. Stephanie had built a career advising clients on exclusive experiences and high-end travel packages. She worked for an international luxury concierge service, coordinating everything from private yacht charters, VIP access. Colleagues described her as demanding, dismissive of standard, frequently citing her client to override staff recommendations. That afternoon, Stephanie had booked a group desert safari tour that included guided dune buggy rides with mandatory safety briefing. tour staff explicitly explained that all rides required either tandem seating with instructor or close supervision on marked flat route. The compound had strict policies prohibiting solo rides for first-time operators, especially in the challenging dune formation surrounding the facility. Multiple staff members informed staff requirements. Dune buggies are designed for desert driving, notoriously unstable, deep sand where soft terrain 30 to 8 rollover. Stephanie immediately demanded solo access to a dune buggy, citing her status as a luxury consultant and insisting she was capable of anything. When staff refused, she became increasingly aggressive, threatening negative reviews and claiming connection to tour operators' corporate management. After 20 minutes of escalated confrontation, the exhausted staff super reluctantly authorized a solo on the condition she stay on marked. Stephanie refused the technician's offer of a 4-point harness and never tightened the lap belts, signed a liability waiver without reading it, and climbed into the vehicle. Within minutes, Stephanie veered off the designated flat route and accelerated toward the steep competition dunes used for professional racing events. Staff members shouted warnings over radio communication, but she ignored them completely. Video footage from another tourist's phone, combined with the compound's CCTV and GPS telemetry logs, showed her buggy climbing a very steep dune at excessive speed, the wheels churning and the buggy losing traction as it crested. She was partially ejected as the buggy rolled, and the chassis came to rest across her torso because she had refused the harness. The staff spotted the flip and called emergency services immediately. They rushed to the scene but found the buggy had sunk into soft sand, making it impossible to lift without mechanical assistance. Stephanie remained struggling to breathe as full weight compressed her. Her face turned blue-gray as rescuers worked desperately to dig around the frame using shovels and secure inches from the pound's on recovery. A recovery truck arrived on site minutes later and, after rigging a winch, successfully lifted the buggy. Paramedics found Stephanie unresponsive with obvious chest deformities and no pulse. Despite immediate CPR and emergency transport to a regional trauma center, she was pronounced dead at 4:50. The autopsy showed that Stephanie had several broken ribs, collapsed lungs on both sides, bruised lung, a torn liver, and massive internal in her abdomen. The crushing injuries caused her to stop breathing and go into shock. Stephanie's parents were devastated, arriving from Paris to confront staff and grieve privately, later holding a small, low-profile memorial for their daughter. The Desert Safari Company faced immediate consequences as several clients canceled reservations after news of the accident spread, with management reporting a notable drop in bookings directly tied to concerns over safety enforcement.
It was May 25, 2018, along Florida's Gulf Coast. Memorial Day weekend had brought record crowds to a popular marine aquarium. Families filled the exhibits under bright afternoon sun, with temperatures in the mid-80s, creating ideal conditions for outdoor attractions and scheduled presentations. 50-year-old Clarette Dawn arrived with her extended family during Memorial Day weekend, dressed in a lightweight cover-up over swim-ready attire. A travel content creator, she frequently filmed immersive destination reviews for her online audience, often seeking closer access than typical visitors. Her family was accustomed to her tendency to test policy boundaries when she believed guest restrictions were negotiable rather than absolute. The aquarium's main attraction was a large dolphin habitat used for scheduled educational presentations. Prominent signage stated that guest interaction and platform access were restricted to trained personnel only. Waist-high barriers separated visitors from the water, and alarmed, self-latching gates secured the staff-only walkways above the pool, which extended more than 15 feet at its deepest point. Clarette had researched dolphin swim programs offered at similar facilities and anticipated she might be able to arrange closer access for her channel. When staff explained that interactive programs required advance booking and were not included with general admission, she argued that as a paying guest, she should be allowed limited platform access for filming. She maintained that supervised entry for content creation was a reasonable request and believed the restriction was flexible rather than absolute. Security responded as visitors paused to watch. While staff attempted to de-escalate, a Marine trainer exited through a staff-only gate to reposition equipment. As the gate closed behind him, Clarette quickly followed before it fully latched, stepping onto the restricted platform above the water. Witnesses shouted warnings. Trainers radioed for emergency response while moving toward her. Ignoring repeated instructions to return, she moved farther along the narrow walkway, continuing her live stream. When security reached the secured gate, they had to wait for controlled access from inside. Without authorization, Clarette lowered herself from the platform's edge and dropped into the pool, feet first, without flotation support. Witness footage later showed her striking the back of her head against the concrete edge during entry before submerging. The impact and sudden immersion left her visibly disoriented. Although the water was not dangerously cold, she surfaced breathing hard and looking around as if unsure where the nearest exit ladder was located. Her movements appeared unsteady as her breathing became increasingly frantic against the smooth habitat walls. During repeated attempts to breathe, she aspirated water and submerged. When she resurfaced, her movements appeared slowed and poorly coordinated. Staff deployed flotation devices while a designated rescue diver entered from a controlled ladder. Within approximately 90 seconds, responders reached her as she slipped beneath the surface again. She was lifted from the pool as personnel initiated CPR on the deck. Paramedics transported her to a nearby hospital. Physicians later determined she sustained a head injury during entry and subsequently aspirated water while disoriented, resulting in prolonged oxygen deprivation and hypoxic brain injury. Despite advanced life support, she did not recover. The investigation concluded she had bypassed barriers, followed authorized personnel through a secured access point, ignored instructions, and entered a restricted habitat without authorization. A safety review confirmed that circulation systems, intake cover, alarms, and infrastructure met regulatory standards. The death was ruled accidental following unauthorized entry into a restricted area. After required inspections and coordination with authorities, the dolphin exhibit resumed operations. Portions of her live stream were reviewed as part of the official report, documenting the sequence of events preceding the incident. It was October 11th, 2018, at a suburban shopping center in Knoxville, Tennessee, where the afternoon air smelled of autumn leaves and fast food, and the parking lot glistened after a light drizzle. Vehicles filled lined spaces as shoppers moved between stores and carts rattled over the asphalt. Greta Langley, 52, managed a mid-size residential property in Knoxville and had developed a near-philosophical view that parking spaces were a moral issue. She had called police on neighbors for minor parking infractions 14 times in 3 years, kept a notebook in her glove compartment tracking license plates, and been involved in 3 parking lot disputes, one resulting in a restraining order later dropped. Greta drove a 2014 SUV, often taking up 2 spaces, photographed other people's vehicles for documentation, and had high blood pressure managed by medication she sometimes forgot to take. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, with brown hair, and a habit of standing rigidly while observing what she perceived as parking misconduct. A 29-year-old logistics coordinator named Dylan Ho parked his 2016 sport motorcycle, a Kawasaki Ninja 650, weighing 421 pounds, in a lined space nearby. The bike was angled slightly per standard motorcycle practice, with a nearly full 4.5-gallon fuel tank and an exhaust pipe still hot from recent riding. Parking spaces were clearly marked, and the bike did not extend beyond its designated area. Greta parked her SUV adjacent to the motorcycle and immediately objected to its proximity. Her driver's side door could not open fully without brushing the mirror, partially because her own SUV was over the line. She photographed the bike from multiple angles and approached the customer service desk, demanding the owner be summoned. When staff explained no manager was available and offered to call security, Greta dismissed them and left the building. Returning to the lot, Greta stood near the bike for several minutes, visibly agitated and taking repeated photos. Passerby Hannah Lee asked if she was okay, and Greta insisted the motorcycle was illegally parked. Witnesses, including bystander Peter Collins, noted the bike was within the lines, but Greta ignored them. She planted her right foot and delivered a hard kick to the motorcycle's lower frame. The motorcycle tipped sideways, pinning Greta's left leg beneath the engine block and frame rail. The impact fractured both her tibia and fibula, trapping her under the motorcycle's full weight. Peter attempted to lift it, but could not, while Hannah called 911. Fuel began leaking from the motorcycle onto the asphalt, likely from the tank vent as the bike lay on its side. When the fuel reached the still hot exhaust pipe, it ignited, starting a small fire that spread along the fuel trail. Flames reached Greta's trapped leg, igniting her jeans and causing severe burns to her left leg, lower abdomen, and right hand. She remained pinned for approximately 40 seconds before Peter and two other bystanders lifted the motorcycle and freed her. EMS arrived 4 minutes later and transported Greta to the regional medical center. She underwent emergency surgery for fractures and burns and initially survived. 8 days later, on October 19th, she died from fat embolism syndrome, a complication where fat from broken bone marrow entered her bloodstream and blocked vessels in her lungs and brain. The local medical examiner determined the cause of death as fat embolism syndrome, secondary to both bone-leg fractures, noting that her pre-existing hypertension contributed. Burns were listed as contributing but not primary cause. Dylan Ho was cleared of all wrongdoing after security footage confirmed the bike was legally parked. Damage to the motorcycle, totaling $3,800, was settled by Greta's estate. Dylan later sold the bike and purchased a truck. It was August 2015 in Lowndes County, Georgia. The late afternoon heat sat at 94 degrees Fahrenheit with the kind of humidity that makes the air feel like it has weight. The neighbor's property was a semi-rural lot set back from the road, partially fenced, with several large dogs kept in varying states of enclosure. It was the kind of property that looks different depending on who's looking at it, and Paula Dunmore had been looking at it closely and repeatedly for over 2 years. Paula Dunmore was 49, a retired county clerk, detail-oriented, persistent, and thorough in the way that people who spend careers managing official records tend to be. She had filed more than 20 formal complaints against her neighbor over that period, documenting what she believed was an unlicensed dog breeding operation running out of the property. Authorities had responded multiple times. Warnings had been issued. No animals had been removed and no operation had been shut down. I think most people in that situation would either accept the outcome or escalate through legal channels. Paula did neither. She started going over herself. She had begun conducting her own informal walkthroughs of the property, approaching unannounced, stepping past the fence line, photographing the kennels and counting animals. She brought a notepad and her phone. Nothing between her and the dogs except her certainty that she had every right to be there. The neighbor had asked her to stop on at least 2 separate occasions. She kept going. That afternoon, she stepped past the fence line again. An unsecured dog, vaccination history unknown and unverifiable, approached and bit her on the forearm. The wound was significant enough that she drove herself directly to the emergency room. I want to stop there for a second, because that decision was the right one. She didn't dismiss the bite. She didn't go home and wait it out. She went to the hospital. And that's what makes the next part so difficult to read. Intake staff documented the bite, noted the unknown vaccination status of the animal, and recommended immediate post-exposure prophylaxis. Because of high patient volume that day, she waited approximately 90 minutes without being formally seen by a physician. She left before treatment was administered, signing a form confirming she was leaving against medical advice. The intake record documented her stated reason. The wait was unacceptable, and she didn't believe the bite was serious enough to justify preventive treatment. Here's the thing about post-exposure prophylaxis for rabies that I didn't fully appreciate before researching this. The window it works in is the window before any symptoms appear. Once the virus reaches the central nervous system and clinical rabies begins, no treatment changes the outcome in any meaningful way. That's not a nuance buried in medical literature. It's the foundational fact of rabies exposure management. The treatment works when the virus is still traveling through the body toward the brain. Once it reaches that stage, survival becomes extremely unlikely. Paula left before the treatment started, and she left because she didn't want to wait. Roughly 6 weeks later, she developed fever, agitation, and difficulty sleeping. She returned to the hospital. By that visit, she was presenting with hydrophobia and confusion. Clinical rabies encephalitis had fully established. The dog was located, euthanized, and submitted for testing. Brain tissue examination confirmed a rabies-positive result. The incubation period was consistent with the bite location and the time elapsed. Paula died in hospital care within 10 days of her second admission. Confirmed cause was rabies encephalitis. The intake record from her first visit, including the form she signed on the way out, was recovered. Her complaint logs against the neighbor were also on file. Following her death, authorities conducted a full inspection of the property. Multiple animals were removed, and the operation was shut down. I've thought about that timing more than once. 2 years of complaints, and it took this to move it. I still don't know what to do with that.
The next situation I found shifts into a grocery store where the setting feels ordinary right up until it doesn't. It was November 3rd, 2020, and a grocery store in Naperville, Illinois, was operating through a routine morning rush. Checkout lines, fluorescent lighting, and the steady noise of refrigeration units. Nothing about the scene suggested anything out of the ordinary. Rhonda Peltier, 61, was a retired direct sales representative active in online medical skepticism and personal rights groups. She had no significant medical history. She was physically healthy, wore reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck, and carried a large, structured tote bag she used as a purse. The kind with a rigid flat bottom and exterior zip pockets she frequently rifled through during arguments to produce her phone. At the store entrance, a sign required face coverings. Rhonda entered without one, stating she was exempt after a brief exchange with staff. She then proceeded inside and later joined a checkout line behind Carol Sims, a cancer patient wearing a mask and moving slowly with her groceries. Rhonda commented on Carol's mask, despite no interaction being initiated by Carol. When Carol did not respond, Rhonda reached forward and pulled the mask from Carol's face by the ear loop. Carol took it back and quietly stated she was undergoing chemotherapy and asked to be left alone. Rhonda dismissed the statement and continued speaking loudly about masks, rights, and restrictions. Several customers in nearby lines began recording the interaction. It didn't even feel like anything serious at first, just people slowly starting to watch. A store employee approached and asked Rhonda to step back from the customer. She refused and continued raising her voice. The situation drew attention from staff, and a manager attempted to de-escalate the conflict. Rhonda remained focused on arguing her position, speaking over instructions and gesturing repeatedly. Her behavior became increasingly agitated and physically animated, drawing further attention from surrounding customers. As the confrontation continued, Rhonda reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone to record what she called harassment by store staff. In doing so, she also dislodged a travel-size hand lotion bottle, cylindrical, uncapped at the bottom, which fell from the bag and landed on the tile floor behind her right foot without her noticing. A moment later, Rhonda took one step backward, a standard shift in posture during the argument, and her right heel landed directly on the lotion bottle. The bottle rolled outward. Her foot went with it. She had no time to correct. Her body weight was already shifting backward, and her arms were occupied, phone in one hand, tote strap in the other. She went down fast, straight back, with nothing to catch herself on. The back of her head struck the tile floor with a single, flat impact. Several witnesses described the sound. She did not attempt to get up. She was unconscious immediately after impact and did not respond to her name. A customer kneeling beside her noted that her right pupil appeared larger than her left within approximately 2 minutes of the fall. Staff called emergency services and began assisting her. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was started while waiting for medical response. Bystanders continued recording the scene as staff attempted basic life support measures. She was treated on scene due to unresponsiveness and transported to a hospital. A CT scan confirmed a large acute epidural hematoma, a blood clot pressing on the brain from the point of impact at the base of the skull. Emergency neurosurgery was performed, but the herniation had already caused irreversible brainstem damage. She did not regain consciousness. Life support was withdrawn 4 days later. The cause of death was acute epidural hematoma secondary to blunt force head trauma. Manner of death accidental. The back of her skull struck the tile floor with sufficient force to fracture the occipital bone and lacerate a blood vessel beneath it, causing rapid bleeding between the skull and brain that compressed critical structures within minutes. Her phone, still recording, was recovered face up on the floor, with footage ending at the moment she stepped back. It was June 7th, 2014. A small art studio in Portland, Oregon, was running one of its weekend glass blowing demonstrations. The kind of thing where a dozen or so people pay to watch a professional work, standing around a central furnace area while the artist walks them through the process. The studio was warm, naturally, and smelled like hot metal and wood ash. Not a big space, but a well-run one. Gemma Ruick was 38 years old, and from the moment she walked in, she was already a problem. She'd come in with a friend who had bought them both tickets as a birthday gift. Her idea of a fun Saturday, apparently. She complained about the parking on the way in, complained about the temperature inside the studio, and threw a fit at the front about not being allowed to bring her coffee cup in. By the time the demonstration started, she was already visibly irritated. About 20 minutes in, Gemma started making herself known. She kept interrupting with loud comments, not questions, just declarations, that the shape wasn't coming out right, that the artist was moving too slowly. At one point, she told the group she'd seen this done better at a mall kiosk. I'd have been mortified if I were her friend. The artist kept his composure and kept working. The rest of the group had gone quiet in that uncomfortable way people do when one person is ruining it for everyone. Then Gemma started pushing closer to the work area, edging past the floor markers that designated the spectator boundary. The artist noticed and calmly told her to step back behind the line. She told him she couldn't see properly from back there. He told her the boundary was a safety requirement, not a suggestion. She told him she'd paid good money for this and wasn't going to stand in the back like she was in a school assembly. He repeated himself. She crossed her arms and stayed exactly where she was. A few minutes later, the artist needed to make a quick adjustment to the propane valve on the side of the furnace. Routine. Something that takes both hands and about 20 to 30 seconds of focused attention. He set the blowpipe down on the rest cradle, a metal support that holds the pipe horizontally, with the gather end extended safely away from the work area, and stepped to the side of the furnace. That was the window. Gemma stepped forward, reached out, and grabbed the blowpipe off the cradle with her bare right hand. Not at the gather end, but roughly midway up the pipe where heat conduction from the molten glass had made the metal dangerously hot. The burn to her palm and fingers was immediate and severe. Her reflex was to pull her hand back, which jerked the pipe toward her and swung the gather end, still carrying a fist-sized glob of glass at close to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, directly toward her face. The molten glass made contact with her left cheek and the left corner of her mouth. At that temperature, glass adheres instantly to skin. It doesn't splash or drip, it bonds. She recoiled sharply, which partially separated the material, but dragged it across the tissue around her lips and the front of her throat just below the chin. The tearing made it worse, not better. The artist turned around within seconds. Removing the adhered glass was not an option. It would have caused further tearing and deeper tissue damage. Other attendees called for emergency services immediately. Responders arrived within about 6 minutes. By that point, the tissue around her mouth and throat had begun to swell rapidly from the thermal injury, and that swelling was the real problem. It was compressing her airway from the outside. She lost consciousness en route to a nearby medical facility. Attempts to establish a surgical airway were severely complicated by the extent of the burns, and the partially hardened glass still adhered to the tissue around her throat. She was pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after the initial injury. The cause of death was thermal burns to the face and throat, with progressive airway compromise resulting from a combination of external swelling, compressing the airway, direct thermal damage to the upper airway mucosa, and inhalation injury to the airway below the glottis. Secondary contributing factors included full-thickness contact burns to the right hand and cardiovascular stress consistent with severe acute burn trauma. The blowpipe was collected as evidence. Witness statements from every attendee confirmed Gemma had crossed the safety boundary, ignored 2 direct instructions to step back, and grabbed the pipe without any contact or prompting from the artist. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. The studio's safety protocols, boundary markers, rest cradle placement, pipe positioning were reviewed and found to be fully appropriate. The case was ruled an accidental death and closed within 2 months.